Hello everyone, I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by David Kurten. Now David is a member of the London Assembly and a candidate for London Mayor, and he's also leader of the Heritage Party. And we're going to explore what it's like to be a voice for parties, for opinions, and for points of view which might be very common and very popular and very normal, but are now viewed as being problematic and viewed with disdain by some of the powers that be. And David's been speaking loudly to these authorities and getting some very interesting responses. So, David, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thank you. Good to be here.
To start off with, on the subject of saying the unseeable, one of the clips that quite a few viewers will have seen is you talking in various, actually in a Zoom format, asking questions of the London Mayor. And one of the questions you were asking was his support for BLM, and then you started to ask him about the actual policies of BLM and did he support them? And the response was somewhat shambolic in terms of he didn't really know what he was supporting. So this is an area where you'd clearly done your research and you'd identified areas that are vital to bring to the public attention, and then the response was kind of ignorant, kind of not dismissive, but this is just, you're not thinking the way we want you to think, so you're on a completely different thread. Is this something you find a lot of? Do you find this kind of mismatch of worldviews when you're trying to interact with your political opponents? What is it that people are now speaking different languages? Is it that they're finding it very difficult to understand each other? And if it is, how do you go about bridging those gaps?
You know, when I'm in the London Assembly, for example, which is where a lot of these issues come up, where I ask questions of Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, I do feel like I'm in another world, really, to the progressive, liberal, metropolitan elite who I would call cultural Marxist in outlook, whereas I would consider that I'm pretty much just in touch with the ordinary person around the country who speaks common sense language and has a common sense understanding of the way that things are. But I've asked many questions about many of these issues over the years, and recently, of course, with the whole Black Lives Matter issue that you talk about, that was something that I think was of great concern to most normal thinking people around the country, where you have a lot of indoctrinated people are smashing up statues, daubing Winston Churchill's statue in Parliament Square, burning the flag on the cenotaph in Whitehall, and generally accusing Britain of being institutionally and systemically racist, which is an absolute calumny. It's a lie. It certainly isn't. Britain is one of the best countries in the world to live in for all people, regardless of your race or whatever characteristics you have. But I walk into the London Assembly and you've got Labour, Lib Dem, Green, and they're obviously right on board the progressive train. And, whatever I say in terms of cultural issues, they sort of look aghast at how dare someone have this opinion, which we don't have. And the Tories are sort of split. I mean, to be honest with you, on an individual basis, the Tories in City Hall are generally quite nice. I get on with them, but they would never ever dream of saying half of the stuff that I say. They would come up afterwards and maybe say, "Oh, we agree with that. It was brilliant," but they wouldn't say it themselves because they're so scared of actually being called one of these names to say, "Oh, you don't agree with me. You're an Islamophobe. You're a homophobe. You're a xenophobe. You're a bigot." And this is what they do all the time to try and keep people in line, and make sure that no one steps out of the accepted boundaries of what they referee as accepted speech. But, you know, the thing is, I've been doing this for so long, and I've just been talking about what I want to talk about and saying what I want to say for so long. It's almost like, oh, okay, well, there he is. He's at it again. You know, there is this rag, I wouldn't call it a paper, but there's this website called Pink News, and I think I keep them in business because I'm in there every month. They do a piece on me. Kurten, he says something homophobic or transphobic, but you know, I'm just in touch with ordinary people, particularly people who don't want their young kids being taught about transgenderism and so on, which is going on at the moment. So there is this.
Well, you've run through a range of things there. There's so much we can talk about there. Let's start. Let's start with cultural Marxism. You mentioned cultural Marxism. All right. Now, for the benefit of listeners viewers who might not have a firm view as to what that means, how do you define it, and how did you come across it? How did you realize it was an important issue?
I think, like a lot of people, it seems to me that there's something very wrong with society and how it's going, and culture and discourse and how it's going. And we all hear the terms political correctness, and we understand that it's there, but we don't understand where it's come from, and we can see that it's becoming more and more pernicious. But you know, I started to look into what was behind this and what was causing this cultural decay in the West. I mean, we have such a wonderful history, you know, and basically we are a civilization that's founded on Christianity, on Christian principles, which are good. But since before I was born, that understanding has been eroded and corroded, you know, and that corrosion was already taking place when I was born in the early 70s. So I started looking into this, and you know, what had caused it. I didn't have any educational background into it, because my degree's in chemistry. I mean, I'm a scientist, you know, interested in maths and so on by you know, what I did in my younger years. But I started looking into this, and the Frankfurt School and the New Left and all of these kind of things. And you know, what cultural Marxism is essentially is that, you know, from the time of Marx and before, Marx postulated that society was unjust because the capitalists had all the wealth and the proletariat had none, and they were oppressed. And so in order to solve society's injustices, so he said, the proletariat had to gain class consciousness, understand that they were oppressed, and then they would rise up and take control of all of the power and wealth from the capitalists, and then we would live in a wonderful utopia. Of course, that doesn't work, and everywhere it's been tried, you don't get a wonderful utopia. You get a land of misery, tyranny, and hunger and death. So that's what happens. But in the late 1910s, early 1920s, the Marxists who were successful in instigating communist revolutions in Russia and the East were perplexed as to why it didn't happen in the West, because there were some revolutions attempted in Germany and Austria and Hungary, Italy, but they weren't successful. They didn't take hold. Nothing happened in the UK or the USA. So Gramsci was one person who postulated that in order to create the conditions for Marxism to take place in the West, you couldn't have a sudden violent revolution like you had in the East, because civil society was too strong. So you'd have to corrode the institutions from within. undermine civil society by changing the way people think, gradually undermining our sort of Christian understanding of how the world works, and glues and holds society together, which he called bourgeoisie. And then the Frankfurt School, independent from Gramsci, but at the same time, were looking at this as well. And Horkheimer, who was the second director of the Frankfurt School, started to develop critical theory, which was a way to criticize destructively every aspect of Western civilization. And then that gave birth later in the 60s to all these kind of new studies that you've got, like you've got gender studies, which undermines the concept that there's two sexes, there's 100 genders, there's women's studies, so you can do that and you can learn why men are bad and the patriarchy is the root of all evil. You can do decolonization studies to learn why Europe is bad and Western civilization is bad, which is leading to the critical race theory that we hear a lot today. And then it goes on. And I mean, I could talk about this all day, but this is where it comes from.
Well, you've raised another vital thing. So the cultural Marxism, and it's important people understand this, was a decision made to destroy society, because only once we've destroyed society can we remake it the way we want to. Right, so it is an attack on society. So when it feels like society is under attack, that's because society is under attack. But you mentioned the critical theory, and the critical theory and the use of it by the postmodernist theorists to subject everything that held society together to an unrelenting barrage of criticism. So this is not judge criticism. This is criticism for political effect, and the things that targeted faith, Christianity. It targeted the family. Always seems to target the family. It targeted morality. It targeted any sort of separation, any hierarchies, any divisions, any borders, any limits. So everything gets this unrelenting attack. And once you realize that this is the game, you can spot it, because there's always something missing, right? There's always, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. Compared to what, right? Because when I started to speak publicly and on things like Twitter and what have you, on the UK call, but I was on Twitter and I was arguing against exactly this, but from a Scottish context, with the Scottish National Party having been completely taken over by the cultural Marxists, the critical theorists, all these ideas. Most of the supporters don't realise this, but that's where the ideas come from. None of the ideas are Scottish. And there's this constant attack on Britain and the British, even though the Scottish are British. It's very strange, almost self-hating kind of approach. And I was resisting this, and I was watching this sort of unrelenting attack. And you think, well, the people you're attacking is us. It's our society you're attacking. Who taught you to do this? Who taught you to hate your own people and call it nationalism? It's a very bizarre thing. And of course, the thing that's always missing is compared to what? There's no positive agenda. They put in Marxism because they don't have anything else, but there's no positive agenda. There's not really any analysis of how anything will work in the new utopia. It's just once we smash everything, the new utopia will emerge. It's inherently destructive. And whenever you see critical anything, like critical race theory or whatever it happens to be, that's where it comes from. It's this determination to destroy, and it's surprisingly effective. If you maybe just outline some of the areas you see it actually has made strides.
The first thing to which helps is for people to understand that this is actually something that's happening, because as I said, a lot of people can see there's something wrong, but you don't understand what is wrong. But if you understand that this cultural Marxism is rooted in sort of academic circles 100 years ago, as ballooned in the 60s and is now coming to ripeness and coming to bear in our day, then you can understand what's going on. You can get a handle on it and you can fight back. But essentially, cultural Marxism takes the original economic Marxism, which sees the world as a conflict between the oppressive business class and the oppressed workers, and translates that into all kinds of different groupings. So you have black people are oppressed by white people. So you get this idea of white privilege. Whites are privileged just because of who they are. They're oppressive. And then you get women are oppressed by men. You get LGBTs are oppressed by Christian society, or heteronormative society, and the idea of systemic injustice. So that goes along. Then you've got society is systemically racist, it's systemically sexist and misogynistic, it's systemically homophobic and transphobic, and also Islamophobic, because Muslims are mostly black or brown in color, so that goes along with racism. So because this is a Christian society, then everyone who's not Christian is therefore oppressed, because we have a historical understanding which is based on Christianity. So these are the specific talons, of coming out of the beast of cultural Marxism. And so, in the summer, there was a big focus on systemic racial injustice. Before, you have various times where people are talking about society's transphobic. You had that last year when people were trying to introduce these programs into school. And you had an interesting situation in Birmingham where you had the Muslims were being accused of being homophobic and transphobic because they didn't want this stuff going into the schools. But then you had other people accusing the sort of LGBTs of being Islamophobic, and no one could really make up their mind for a time whether they are we going to be homophobic Islamophiles, or are we going to be Islamophobic homophobes or philes or whatever? They couldn't make their mind up. But eventually, the Labour MPs and so on turned on the Muslims and supported the LGBT stuff going into schools. So
yes, and that's a clue. We'll come to them in a minute. This is I've gone back to read at least some of these sort of core tenets that's generated a lot of this from the postmodernists, and realised that what this was at heart was an attack on Enlightenment values. Now, Enlightenment values, I think there are problems there, and their attack on them was brilliant. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to their critique of the problems with the Enlightenment, and I'm thinking, well, I agree with all of that, and it's really astute and it's really brilliant. Where it falls down is they have nothing else to put in. They can destroy, but there's nothing positive. And all the things that claim to be positive aren't really there to be positive. They're just there to destroy something else. Hence, they'll support the Islamic community because we're right behind the Islamic community. And then all of a sudden they won't, because what they're trying to do, what they're trying to destroy, the Islamic community is actually trying to support, namely the family. So then they turn on the Islamic community because there's another group that they're using to destroy the family. And when it suits them to turn on that group, that I think that they'll turn on the LGBT group as well. And you see that actually happening, where there's now vitriolic, hate-filled dispute within the LGBTQ community about about the transgenderism, and whether that is something that's going to be supported or not. So there's now warfare within the LGBT community, and they're turning on, for example, the lesbians who want to have women-only spaces. They're now being targeted for horrendous abuse and threats and all the rest of it, because they've gone from being the wedge issue that's used to destroy society to, you're now defending some aspect of society, you're defending women-only spaces, you're defending a division you're defending borders, you're defending rules, you're defending limits. So they're now getting hammered by the same process. And this is what so many people don't understand, is it will come, whatever you are, whatever color you are, whatever beliefs you have, this philosophy will come for you. It's just a matter of time until you cross it, and it will come for you too.
Yeah, it's absolutely parasitical. And, you know, in the 60s, you had, you know, I would say progressivism used liberalism. So there's all these people who had these wonderful ideas about being liberal, you know, the whole sexual revolution, free love and so whatever, and second wave feminism. We don't need men. We can just, you know, sleep around, and we don't need to get married and all this. And that was something that progressive cultural Marxism used to destroy the family very, very much. So, you know, it didn't completely destroy it, but it destroyed millions of people's lives who went off in a different direction. But now you've got those people, as you say, those original people who, you know, to some extent do believe in free speech. Well, they completely believe in free speech, are now being told, oh, you can't make jokes, you can't say this, you can't say that, and are now finding that they're being eaten by the progressive beast that has eaten liberalism whole and spat it out. You know, now you find, as you say, people like J.K. Rowling, people like Germaine Greer, who were cause célèbres, you know, in the past, new hardcore feminists. Are now finding that, well, they don't think the very latest right woke thing on transgenderism, so therefore they are to be cancelled, no platformed, and they are now persona non grata. But, you know, where's it going to go? Because you can jump on the latest woke thing, the woke bandwagon, and, you know, 5 years, 10 years down the line, you'll find that your opinions, which you were considered the right on thing today, are not going to be accepted in 5 years' time. So,
well, on the subject of where it's going to go, right, one of the things, certainly in Scotland, and we're worse in Scotland because we have a woke government. We have a government that's completely surrendered to every idea from cultural Marxism, from political correctness, from the postmodern authoritarian left. They've surrendered to a lot, and it's quite interesting how those ideas have come in, because a lot of that was done intentionally. Because when the Scottish Parliament was getting set up, all the think tanks from America saw this as a clean slate, and they opened up in Scotland, so they would have people on the ground to influence this new parliament as it found its feet and make sure it went in the appropriate progressive direction. So the ideas, you can trace where they came from, and they're not Scottish, they're not British. They are genuinely foreign to this country.
You know, it really, sorry, it really breaks my heart, to be honest, because I went to university in St Andrews. I was in the 90s. I spent 4 wonderful years in Scotland. I mean, some people might say, oh, it's not real Scotland, it's full of English people. But, you know, I very, very much loved my time in Scotland when I was there. And to see what's happened to it now, you know, this wonderful, happy-go-lucky, welcoming, beautiful, friendly, free place that I remember, you know, is now being completely taken over by this woke, politically correct, suffocating culture. I mean, it's just a horrible thought.
There's a lot more. There's a lot more fear. There's a lot more fear in the population. There's a lot less contentment than there was when you were here. Yeah. So, but what's happening, because we've got that government in Scotland, we're having this pushed via Parliament, via legislation. So we had the named person attempt to put a state official in at the head of a family, essentially, what they were doing, a state-appointed guardian, who was slightly above the parents and would gather all the information and decide when the state was going to intervene based on their gut feel. Didn't need any evidence. Gut feel was enough. That was eventually thrown out. All the Scottish courts surrendered to this. It was eventually thrown out in the Supreme Court in London. But we've got the hate crime bill going through, which is truly horrendous. We've got the Gender Recognition Act being seriously considered for revision, where that will mean that things like female-only spaces will have to go, because if you say you're a woman, you're a woman, essentially. We've got a tax on the family. We've got a tax on free speech. We've got a legal system that is getting ever more oppressive. Now, you are part of the London Assembly, right? You're the awkward squads, perhaps, but you're in this. You're seeing this. You're seeing this more directly. Do you see the same thing in London? Is it being pushed by legislation and by rules and regulations coming out of the Assembly?
Well, it's slightly different because the London Assembly doesn't have the same power as the Scottish Parliament or the Senate in Wales. It's really like a big select committee. So our only function really is to question the mayor. And the mayor has total power, but only over police and crime and transport. So he doesn't really have any legislative power over any other areas. So it's slightly different. It's more like glorified local government. But on the plenary sessions, the Labour Party and the Green Party in particular do always bring in these motions which support the progressive causes. And back earlier this year, they put in one motion that's saying, we support LGBT education in schools. And I was the only person to stand up and say, I oppose this. I don't think that parents' rights should be taken away from them. And if they don't want their children to learn something that is opposed to traditional family and faith values, they should have the right of veto over that, which is actually enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. I think it's Article 2, Section 1, I think. I might be wrong on that, but it's one of those things. So, and one by one, all the other groups stood up to condemn me, and unusually, when they'd finished their speeches, they all clapped each other for condemning my speech, and they said, this is disgusting, this is disgraceful, this is outrageous, all these words that they used. But, I got such an amazing response and support for that because I was the only one who I think really was in tune with what the majority of the country is thinking. And, you've got the Tories pushing this in England, you've got the SNP pushing it even harder in Scotland, you've got Labour pushing it in Wales, and I think probably Sinn Féin pushing it in Northern Ireland, so you've got different parties, but basically they're all the same, so which is in a way, we might talk about this later.
I'd like to get to the LGBT education side in a wee bit more detail just in a moment. Just before we leave the London Assembly, Sadiq Khan's got control over policing. Now, we know in Scotland that we've got politicised policing because the head of the Scottish Police Authority, Susan Deacon, when she resigned in a resignation letter, said so. Right? This is one of the problems. We've got politicised policing.
Okay.
But I don't think we've got politicised policing to the extent that you do in London.
Yeah, I think we definitely have politicised policing. We've seen that quite clearly this summer. You had Sadiq Khan on the 6th of June said about the BLM marches, I support you and I feel your pain. So, and the police really didn't do anything much at all. In fact, some of them got down on their knees in front of an aggressive bunch of Marxists. I mean, it was absolutely shocking. But then when a group of patriots went out to stand around the statue of Winston Churchill, which had been vandalized because they were against vandalism, they got absolutely smeared by the mayor, by Priti Patel, by the mainstream media, all these kind of right-wing thugs, this is the narrative that they put out. And yeah, there were some people who were a bit rough around the edges there, but basically these were people who were against vandalism, and you have the leaders of the country and the Met Police speaking against them. So, I mean, everything has been turned completely on its head. And we saw this very much so last month when there were protests against the lockdown, freedom rallies. And I spoke at one on the 19th of September. And I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen with my own eyes columns of riot police coming in, trying to attack the crowd, attack the stage, close down a peaceful demonstration for civil liberties, when Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter were allowed to get away with whatever they like. I mean, this really is at the very least, if I'm being very, very polite, it's inconsistent. But I mean, if I'm being honest, I think it's brazenly politicized, and it's absolutely wrong. And that's why I'm standing for London Mayor. I want my city back, and I want common sense back, and I want an end to all this, absolute wickedness which is going on, I think.
Right. Okay. You mentioned Priti Patel there, right? Priti Patel,
yes, did
not resist the politicization of the police that was happening with Sadiq Khan. Most people who voted Conservative, I think, would have expected her to do so. The sort of reception she got when she came into office, there was a huge amount of positivity and positive feeling towards her in the country, because she first came up, there was some conflict between her and the civil servants about getting a report out on the grooming gangs, and you could see the people cheering her on. You go get them, Priti. You tell them. So they wanted her to be a voice for them in the corridors of power. Now, what's wrong with the Tories is my next question.
Well, that's just one indication, that's of the rot in the whole Tory party. Because, I'm like you, I didn't vote for them in the December 2019 election, but I was fairly happy when they got in. And it wasn't the Jeremy Corbyn Marxists that got in. And they had a lot of goodwill and a huge amount of support right up to the north of England. I think they got quite a few MPs in Scotland, more than they have done in previous years. But they've squandered it all. They've disappointed everyone on every level, particularly with the policing. Not being quick to condemn the Black Lives Matter protests, but again, condemning the Patriots. Again, when the lockdown thing was there, condemning civil liberties protesters. When the boats are coming across the channel, time and time again saying, we're going to do something, but then nothing happens. So, this happens every single time. The Tories come to an election, they sound conservative, they say the right things, and as soon as they get in power, they just throw it all out of the window and they do exactly the opposite. And then they come to another election and they do the same thing. And they play one trick which always works. They say, vote for us or you'll get Miliband and Sturgeon. Vote for us or you get Corbyn. You might not like us, but if you don't vote for us, you're going to get someone who's worse. And they play this trick. And
you work alongside some of these people. You know them. Do you have a handle on why?
Well, I would say that some of the Tories in the London Assembly I really do like. They're really decent on a one-to-one level. And I think if they were free, then they might actually come and join me, join us. And Peter Whittle is my colleague in the Brexit Alliance there. But they're part of the party machine and they have to toe the party line. So there are some of them who are actually not conservative at all. They're like liberal Democrats. They're lefties, but they joined in order to get ahead. They're careerists. There's others, they're like meat on a seat. Basically, they just sit there and they do what they're told and they vote in the way that they're told. Whatever they think, they just do it because, well, okay, we were selected, so that's it. There's very, very few who have got the balls and the courage to actually stand up and speak with the courage of their convictions. There's very, very, very few. And there's one or two. There's Desmond Swayne in the Parliament who's actually come out against the lockdown and voted against the government. That's it takes some courage to do that because you're in danger of losing the whip if you're in the Commons. You don't want to be seen as a rebel because if you rebel too much, then you get deselected. But I've been offered, by people. They say, come and join us, come and join us. But I thought, well, that's very nice of you. But if I did, I wouldn't be able to say what I say. I think, well, what's the point of that? Even if it does get me somewhere, Jesus said, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? So I decided I'm not going to join somewhere where I lose my soul. Even if I don't get anywhere, I'm just going to be true to what I need to be true to, which I think is the truth, and just be able to say what I need to say, and offer a real alternative, but not join this lib lab con uni party that basically is just leading us in the same direction to destruction.
Yes, you mentioned losing soul. That brings us to LGBTQ education. Now, we've got this in Scotland as well. In fact, it's everywhere. It's in Ireland, and the core documentation that promotes it is internationalist. It's from the UN, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, organizations like this. And what it says is, in short, that teaching queer theory and sexualizing children at a very young age is a good thing and should be done. And what you would term a traditional education and upbringing, which views such things as harmful, is made to be toxic, is made to be repressive and somehow injurious. So this is shown up in Scotland, and there's a small party in Scotland called the Scottish Family Party who have been leading on exposing this, and doing so very effectively and not very gently, and good on them. And what they've shown is the Scottish government's own information. So toxic is it that when the leader of the Scottish Family Party stood up in a public meeting to quote some of the things they were teaching school children back to John Swinney, the responsible minister, the woman running the meeting ran out in front of the stage waving her arms and said, "You can't say that, we're live streaming." He said, "Well, I'm reading what you're teaching our children. If it's too shocking, too sexualized, too graphic for your live stream, why are you telling this to our kids?" Now, the sort of things of teaching is every sort of sexual practice, however depraved. It openly advocates and promotes the use of pornography. And it's all done with its harm reduction. Okay, so this is the veneer it's given, and it is at heart the introduction of queer theory, which is another form of critical theory. It's destroying any sort of normal male-female relationship and breaking it all down, breaking down the family, breaking down everything, using a viewpoint which advocates for homosexuality and a lot more besides, which is called queer theory. What are you seeing of this in London?
Well, I think I've been instrumental in working with groups to push back on this. And this is something that when Theresa May was the Prime Minister, I mean, she basically was giving Stonewall and all of the LGBT groups everything that they asked for. They wanted to go into schools. They wanted to bring these programs into children at as young an age as possible, backed by the teaching unions and Ofsted. But you had a lot of schools which were threatened with being failed by Ofsted for not teaching transgenderism, queer theory, homosexual relationships to young children against the wishes of parents. And there has been some changes in the guidance, because there has been quite a pushback in England. There was a program called All About Me, which had some very, very graphic details in there, what they call their sextionary, I suppose, is play on the sex dictionary word, which was available to children in Warwickshire, which was, all kinds of things that I'd never heard of, to be honest. And, I really don't think that children should come anywhere near. But the guidance has changed to say you don't have to teach LGBT in primary schools. But if the head teacher decides that he wants to teach it, then the parents don't have any say in the matter. But they do have to consult with parents, and they do have to make the lesson content available for parents to peruse before the lessons take place. They've just issued some new guidance in September, which actually does say that children should not be taught that not conforming to gender stereotypes means that they're a different gender to what they are. So there is now, even in the guidance, a little bit of pushback against teaching the transgenderism, but that's not compulsory. And it's still, it's like they've gone 3 or 4 steps in the wrong direction. You're coming back 1 step. But, we mustn't relax, because then they're just going to carry on pushing onwards. And this is the mistake that I think conservatives always make. You think, we pushed back. They've gone so far and we pushed back a little bit. Okay, we've won. No, you haven't won. This is exactly the Hegelian dialectic, where you start at one place, then the cultural Marxists say, we're going to go here. So you got your thesis, your antithesis, and then there's a bit of a pushback. We have a settlement. That is your synthesis in the middle. So they've got half of what they want, and this becomes the new normal. And then they go, okay, we're going to go over here now. And you go, oh no, we'll come back. Oh, and then they've gone here. So they've moved on, and then you push back a little bit, and then they were in the place they wanted to be in the first time. Yeah, so what you got to do, they go there, you got to push back and back and back all the way and nail them to the door. That's what we got to do. Not.
I think you're right. This is exactly the problem with conservatism, because it's not ideologically capable of recovering lost ground. Once the ground is lost, they don't even try.
But I'm going to say something here, which is not everyone might agree with me, but I think the reason is that conservatism is about conserving our traditions, and that's a wonderful thing, and trying to keep the status quo. But that doesn't have any grounding. It doesn't have any philosophical or spiritual basis. When it is divorced from Christianity and Christian principles, which our country's found on, there is no foundation. It's like building conservatism on the sand. Unless you build on the foundation of Christian principles, teaching in the Gospels, the Bible, and so on, that is the foundation of our society. And unless we get back to that understanding, we won't have any solid ground to rebuild. Because you hear nationalists and so on talk about our traditions. It's our traditions that are important. Well, traditions are great, but they've got to have some real grounding in something. And I think that's what has been lost from before I was born, and to come back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Unless we get back to that understanding, the conservatism is meaningless. You've got to actually get back to your foundations, which our forefathers had, which are Christian foundations, and that's something that is worth, solid to rebuild on.
Yes, indeed. David, just before we finish, could you tell us a little bit about the Heritage Party?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so again, similar to what we were saying before, I think the Conservative Party just simply are not conservative. They are now progressive, and they're doing everything that they is against and opposed to what they should be doing. I think there's millions of people who are disappointed by what they've got in the Johnson government, and also there's millions more who are very, very disappointed in Labour, who are socially conservative but maybe would have more of a sort of left-wing view of economics. And I think that wanted to create a new party which could represent the millions of common sense people who just want, something normal. Again, we will defend and protect our culture and heritage, traditional family values, free and fair markets, national sovereignty, obviously wanting to come out of the EU, but also out of the growing influence of the UN, which is another progressive body that has a massive influence on all the nations of the world in a way that I think most people don't understand. Protecting our environment, self-sufficiency in skills, low immigration, and also a party which is pro-life, because there is no mainstream party that represents people who are pro-life. So all of those things together, I think, it's setting out some values which I'm hoping will create like a conservative coalition. You might not agree with every single thing that is in our values manifesto, but hopefully people will be able to come together and support what we're trying to do.
The pro-life element, you share that also with the Scottish Family Party. The pro-life element is very interesting to me, because not only is it, I think, a key issue that shows spiritually where any idea or philosophy or individual human being's heart happens to lie, because if you'll murder the unborn, there's really nothing you won't do. And any political movement that endorses that essentially has sold out completely. But over the last, I've always had the view that abortion's wrong, and that life is life. But I've noticed over the last maybe decade, that argument, partly I think because of high resolution ultrasound, that argument has been won. And you're seeing the advocates for abortion becoming increasingly desperate. Now, it's not permeated the mainstream of politics so far, but culturally, I think that argument's been won. I think more and more people are convinced that you cannot have killing in the UK, where now over 9 million unborn babies have been killed since the Abortion Act became law. You can't have this ongoing Holocaust and call yourself a civilized country. And it's not defensible. And the defenses that they try to use, namely that the human life was worth nothing, and that the killing was therapeutic for the mother, both of these are shown to be without justification, without any substance. And I can now see the abortion lobby scratching around to try and get another set of arguments together. They're clearly in retreat. And this is maybe one area where the culture war has actually been won.
Look, I mean, we look back at slavery and we think it's awful and abhorrent, and we think, how could anyone do that? But the people who lived in the 16th, the 17th and 18th century, they just accepted it as normal. I mean, it wasn't, it was awful. But we look back now, 200 years on, and go, oh, okay, well, we live in more enlightened times. We don't do that anymore. I think in 200 years' time, people are going to be looking back at this century and saying, oh my, what an absolute horror went on here, with 9 million children in 50 years killed in the UK, 40 million in the USA. I don't know how many around the world. I mean, hundreds of millions of children have been killed, aborted by these huge multi-billion-pound businesses that make a lot of money out of it. And I really think that's going to be the case. And it's almost incomprehensible how some people are now advocating for abortion to be allowed for any reason up to birth. I really don't see, what on earth must be going through these people's souls. I don't know. But yeah, I'm absolutely against it, and I think it's a horror. We've had a Holocaust and a half
in this country. And I think there's a silent majority that are against it. But again, you have the guard dogs of the media will attack anybody who doesn't have the right progressive opinion. But I think quietly, silently, underneath the surface, people are starting to realize that this is an awful thing. And I have a huge amount of support from pro-life groups, from Catholic groups, because they want a party that represents them. And I hope that, again, this will be part of a conservative coalition to restore goodness to our country, which has been broken down by all the other parties and the mainstream media and cultural Marxist and education working together.
David, we certainly need goodness restored. It's been lovely talking to you tonight. Perhaps if we get a chance to speak again, we might go into some of the deeper underlying spiritual aspects, because you mentioned what's really inside people who are advocating these things. Well, that's an interesting question, and maybe next time we'll get to that. But for the moment, David, thank you very much.
Thank you.